So I want to thank everyone for coming today for the Terrestrial Analogs Focus Group meeting. This is a focus group sponsored by SSERVI, the Solar System Exploration Research Virtual Institute, and open to the entire community so that we can share thoughts and research and findings regarding terrestrial analog fieldwork. So this group is chaired by myself. I'm Jen Heldman. I'm at NASA Ames Research Center. And Tim Glotch at Stony Brook University, and Darlene Lim also at NASA Ames. So what we're going to do today, I wanted to remind everyone, here's just a quick agenda. I only have a few slides because really Nick is the star of the show today. He's going to give us a great talk. But I want to everyone what this group is about. So we do have a charter. It's listed on the Analogs Focus Group website, on the SSERVI website. And what we had stated before at one of our founding meetings is that terrestrial analog field studies offer us a unique opportunity to prepare for robotic and human planetary missions, conduct studies and tests relevant to science and mission operations and technology in relevant environments. And hold on, my 3-year-old just came in. Hi. Mommy. Okay. So the SSERVI Analogs Focus Group brings together members of the community to discuss and review various aspects of fieldwork, including but not limited to field sites, logistics, instrumentation, ConOps, software, hardware, etc. So this is really a chance to bring people together with common interests and common focus so we can all help each other conduct analog fieldwork and also promote analog fieldwork so we can continue doing this research. So some of the things that this group has been doing, so we've started this quarterly seminar series. We've been hosting them virtually, and they're all posted online for later viewing. So many thanks in advance to Ricky Guest, who records the video, processes it, and posts it on the SSERVI website. So I will let everyone know via an email announcement when that is done, so you can send folks there. I already had a few people already inquire if it will be recorded so they can watch it later because of conflicting meetings today. And then also we want to promote discussion regarding analog science and exploration and what we can do to help each other and also to be of benefit to NASA to do this type of research to help promote human and robotic exploration. So as we're going through, if you have ideas or things you'd like this group to do or things you'd like to see, things that have come up before are logistics discussions. Like our first kickoff talk was about logistics and how to run analog campaigns. We've talked about a publications database or just a listserv, you know, if there are new analog research papers that come out, so we can send that out to the listserv just to keep everyone involved. Organizing special sessions at meetings and conferences. We can help organize special analogs focused sessions. So these are just some ideas so that we can help keep moving along the field of analog science. So today what we're going to do is turn it over to Nick Schmerr from University of Maryland at College Park. His seminar today will be about geophysical exploration at planetary analog fields. And so what I'll do now is I will stop sharing and I will let Nick share his slides and turn it over to him to give the rest of this talk. We will be able to take questions at the end, and I'll be monitoring the chat box if you have other questions during Nick's talk as well.
All right, so can everybody see my screen? And can you hear me?
Yes, and yes.
Awesome, great. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about some of the work that my research group has been working on and some of the new things that we're going to be basically moving into over the next 5 years as we get this new SSERVI project GEODS up and off the ground. So I guess I'll just launch right in. My goal here today is to provide a little bit of an overview of what geophysicists think about in terms of planetary analogs. So I'm sort of turning back into my professor hat and talking a little bit about what geophysics is and does. And then I'll go into some description of some of the planetary analogs that we've been doing in my research group that are focused specifically on using geophysics to address exploration and science questions and thinking about how we can go and expand what we know here on Earth out into the solar system and beyond. So that's sort of the overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. So let me make sure I'm clicking on the right thing. So first of all, what exactly is geophysics? Well, geophysics is this interesting multidisciplinary approach to looking at the Earth and planets, where we combine sort of what we know about geology, which includes things like planetary structure, the kinds of processes that go into that, the history and the evolution of that body, with physics, which is sort of a description of the way the universe works, you know, talking about mechanics or waves or heat, that kind of thing. And we usually combine that with a mathematical description of these behaviors. So it's a way of essentially quantifying some of the things that we see in geology, and understanding it and making predictions for essentially how these different systems work. So it's very multidisciplinary by nature. So here's just an example. Here's a geological cross-section here in the upper left, where we have just a very simple structure of a basement rock with some you know, lava flows and maybe a crater ejecta on top of that, with a little bit of physics and math describing essentially what we would expect the gravity anomaly of some sort of spherical body or body at depth. We can predict essentially the change in acceleration due to gravity because of that density anomaly at depth, and create a mathematical description that allows us to essentially predict what that looks like. So then in geophysics, we can take a model of the subsurface. Here's just sort of a geometrical model where I've changed the density between some of these different deposits, and make a prediction for the kind of gravity that we might see at that. And then we can compare those data to observations from like a gravimeter. So it lets us start to sort out essentially what's going on at depth and understand better without actually having to go down there and look at it. So what kinds of things can we actually study with geophysics? Well, there's a wide variety of different tools and techniques that are represented in the discipline of geophysics. I don't have time to go through all of those today. I wish I did, but the key ones that people think about, and there's many others, but gravity, seismology, looking at the whole wide spectrum of electromagnetic waves and how we can actually use those to sound the subsurface. Thinking about how the magnetic field can be used to study the interior of the Earth. We also study just the shape of the Earth with geophysics. This is geodesy and geodesics. We can get predictive. We can go into the laboratory, make measurements, and predict how various materials will behave at depth under pressure and temperature for different compositions. And then we can just look at how heat flow or heat moves around inside the interior. So there's these different methods that we have out there, and they're sensitive to different components of the rock or the geology that you're looking at. And we can measure them with different kinds of tools. And then we measure different quantities, and then we can make these connections through the physics between these different things. And like I said, I don't have time to go through all of these here, but I just want to sort of give folks a taste for the kind of different things that geophysicists think about. And so here's some examples of measurements, at least in the United States. I know this is US focused, but I just wanted to show how we can kind of use our own country as an example of the kinds of things that people have measured. So folks have gone out and painstakingly collected these data sets, the gravity anomaly across the US. And so by looking at this, you can get information about, say, the underlying topography, thinking about what kind of changes in densities there are rocks. You can see hidden subsurface structures that you would never have guessed. You know, beneath Iowa and Minnesota, there's this big mid-continent rift, for example, that doesn't show up at the surface because it's covered over with this veneer of essentially flat-lying sedimentary rocks. We can look at the magnetic anomaly and see sort of similar things where there's changes in the structures of the rocks. We can look at the heat flow that's there. That tells us a lot about the active tectonics and how essentially close the mantle is to the surface on some level, right? And then we can also go to seismic modeling, where we take measurements of the way waves travel through the interior, and then we can start to image with depth using this tomography approach, the changes in those velocities. And so this gives a really great amount of information, and this is actually sort of a combination of things that have happened over the last 10, 15 years with the US EarthScope array, where we had stations measuring all across the United States, gives us a huge wealth of information that we can then try and use to understand what's going on in the subsurface and better understand the surface geology that's happening. So when we have geophysical data, there's a couple of ways that geophysicists think about how to interpret this, and basically take something that you measure in the field and turn it into like a geological model that you can start to go in and compare to your other observations. The first of these, which is probably something everybody here has heard of, is called inversion. In inversion, we take a data. So in this case here, that's an observation. And then we use theory. And then from that, we can then recover essentially a structural model. So how some parameter varies with depth and space, and maybe even time. And so an example of this is seismic tomography, where the data there are travel times, arrival times of P and S waves. And then the theory relates how much of that travel time is accrued through each little box in your model. And then the structural model then tells you essentially how the velocity varies in each of those little boxes. So you can do this with all the many of the different types of geophysical tools. There's also forward modeling, where we have some sort of structural model. So if you know something about your geology a priori, and you know the theory about how that structure as it varies should give you some sort of signal, you can then go in and predict the data, and then you can do misfitting between the data and what your model basically is saying. So an example of this is where we can compute basically from some structural model, some variation in velocity and density with depth, in the theory of wave propagation, to predict basically what the seismograms would look like for that particular model. And the third of these is what I call theory formulation. Is essentially what you have is some data about how something behaves, and then you have a structural model, but you don't have a theoretical relationship between those two. So you can then start to derive essentially the equations that would describe how those two models work together. So this is something like what the rock and mineral physicists in our community do, is where they try to basically observe systems and understand their structure and then create theoretical models that can then predict essentially the kinds of structures that you might get. All right, and so here's an example, the real world outcrop here on the left, all right? And so there's two different kinds of models that we can derive from this. There's the geological model, which, you go up there and you map out the different rocks, looking at different textures and colors and that kind of thing. And so you might see like a little horizon here in this layer on top, but there's also, some other layers underneath. And so you might be able to create like a cross section that shows sort of these changes in lithology and changes in texture. But then if you go and then measure it, say with a resistivity experiment, and you find that the resistivity throughout the entirety of this layer is essentially the same, basically the geophysicist is not seeing these smaller layers, but they're instead seeing some just sort of uniform properties. But in this deeper layer here at the bottom of the outcrop, there is no geological contact, but you see a change in the resistivity, which maybe is an indication that there's a change, something that's in the fundamental composition of those materials, maybe an accessory magnetite, but it doesn't have a geological expression in the outcrop. So there's these different sensitivities, and the geophysics allows us to try and start to pull apart, okay, where are these contrasts? And there may or may not have one-to-one correlation with what you see exactly in that outcrop. And note that this is a 1D model where you're just basically looking at a change in a property as a function of, in this case, depth. So we can get more interpretive and look at, instead of just the 1D variation, a change through a particular point, instead we can look at like a 2D where we take a cross section through some sort of structure and basically look at how it varies. This is also resistivity changing as a function of the properties of the materials at depth. And usually this is you take a bunch of measurements in a line at the surface. Or we can do a 3D survey where we take a whole bunch of different lines or a whole bunch of different point measurements and start to map out how resistivity changes here. In this case, we're looking at how resistivity changes as a function of where some sort of waste product has been buried in the beneath the surface. So we can think about things in both 1D, 2D, and 3D in geophysics and look at the subsurface in these different dimensions. And of course, we can also do 4D if we have multiple measurements over time as well. There are some limitations. This isn't the cure-all, throw away your geological hammer, go pick up your seismometer. No. Geophysicists have a number of limitations that are put onto our methods. We need to have some sort of change in physical properties to actually be able to make a measurement. If your rock maybe has a red sandstone over a really sort of clean sandstone that doesn't have a lot of iron in it, but they have exactly the same seismic velocity, I'm not going to be able to tell you where that contact is, even though it's obvious as day in the geological cross-section. We also have this problem of non-uniqueness, where multiple structural models can equally fit the data. That means that this solution and that solution basically look identical to the geophysics. So we can get around this a little bit by using a variety of different geophysical tools, but of course that adds sort of to the complexity of the kind of experiment that we might want to do. A lot of geophysical tools, the resolution that we get, the ability to resolve, like, the size of that boulder at depth, or the variation in that parameter, is really dependent upon the wavelength of the tool that we use to go after this. Oftentimes, electromagnetic waves, seismic waves, they have different frequencies that translate to different wavelengths. And so a really long wavelength structure is going to be able to see large scale structure, but not be able to resolve really smaller things like little pebbles or something like that. And then as you go to the really small wavelengths, you start to run into this problem of where for every cycle of your wave, you start to lose a little bit of energy due to attenuation, dispersion, that kind of thing, absorption of energy, friction. So you're not able to go quite as deep, or you're not able to see structures that go beyond sort of the loss of all of that energy. So this is actually another problem, is that as you go to higher wavelength, you think, why don't you just always work at the highest resolution? The problem is that, of course, then you're going to lose energy as you go down to depths. You're not able to see quite as deep. So that's sort of a common problem. And then, of course, the monkey on everybody's back in terms of trying to make scientific measurements is noise. And there's all kinds of different geophysical noise depending upon the tool that you're using. And so here's an example from a quarry with, I think it's looking like limestones, that has some sort of visible layering where you can see changes in color and maybe some texture, which is our nice geological model. But if you go out there with your geophysical tool and measure the resistivity of this layer, you find that basically there's no real contrast, right? So even though there's really obvious layering maybe in this, there's absolutely no differences between those layers in terms of their geophysics. So this would not necessarily be the tool that you want to use to actually determine the layering within the subsurface structure if you didn't have access to this outcrop. Now, maybe there is changes in the seismic velocity and you'd be able to see that sort of layering there, but then you would have to use a wave that has enough resolution to see the differences between the thicknesses of these layers. So that's just an example of how contrast can limit our geophysics. There's all kinds of noise in the environment. I mean, I'm using Earth noise here because this is sort of the environment that we're most familiar with, but obviously in the planetary setting, we're going to have different kinds of noise. You know, seismic noise is from anything moving in your environment, all right? So if you have an atmosphere and oceans, it's going to create a lot of noise that you have to deal with. If you have spacecraft moving around nearby, you're going to have some noise that you're going to have to deal with for a seismic experiment. Now one person's noise is another person's signal. So, you know, an astronaut moving around might actually be something useful to you for your geophysics experiment. When you start getting into the EM field, you need to be concerned about things like atmospheric, you know, waves that come from electrical storms and maybe interaction with the atmosphere with the solar wind and all of that. So, and there's also the sun itself will show up in the changes in the magnetic field, for example. So you have to be cognizant of that. I mean, we don't have the cultural problems of like buried pipelines and cables and stuff on other planets, but if you're working near you know, say a future lunar habitat or base where there's been cables that have been buried or power lines that have been put around, you're gonna have to be cognizant of that if you're trying to do a magnetic survey, for example. So a wide variety of noises, and you should always be cognizant of that before you start your experiment. And then, of course, we have some limitation that comes from just the geometry of how you do your data collection. Geophysicists like to think about data collection either as like a point where you're collecting data continuously or making repeat observations at like an observatory or a single station. So InSight on Mars is an example of a single station, for example, or, you know, a single magnetic observatory here on Earth. If you want to start to look at like cross sections and thinking about the variation in subsurface with depth as a function of some distance away from the initial observation, you have to start stretching out a line of observations or making multiple measurements at different points. And then if you want to go full 3D, you're going to need to usually spread out your survey, right? And so when designing the experiment that you're trying to do, you need to be thinking about the size and the depth of the targets that you're interested in. If you're looking for the variation in pebbles beneath, you know, 2 meters of sediment, you're going to change the design of your experiment to adapt versus something where you're looking for the core of Earth, right? You're going to use very different approaches to do that. It's also important to be thinking about how the subsurface varies. You know, like if you're looking at nicely even flat-lying layers, it's going to be very different than, let's say, you have like a glacial till or a regolith that's been jumbled up and broken up or has a wide variety of different materials built within it. So that's going to sort of affect your ability to resolve those different size structures. And then, of course, the logistics of actually deploying this. If you're trying to do like a 3D survey and you have 2 hours to do it and, you know, X amount of power and mass, it's going to be a lot more challenging than thinking about maybe, okay, let's just go down to 2D and see what we can learn from that. A lot of geophysics experiments are either active source, meaning that we use some sort of powered instrument that sends waves or sends signal down into the subsurface and we look that comes back. So, for example, GPR is a powered kind of source. An active source seismic where you've exploded something or hit the ground is another kind of active source. Or you can just listen. So you can take advantage of the background ambient fields or things that are changing through time and use that to actually find structure. So like listening for earthquakes or letting a magnetic field vary and studying how the structure that you're sitting over responds to that magnetic field variation is one way to do that. And then, of course, you're all tied back to the instruments that you use, right? So if you use a really poor instrument, you're not going to necessarily be able to see all of your signals. So if you have a large amount of noise in the background, like if I tried to put a seismometer out in the middle of a busy street, I wouldn't expect to see much other than the cars going by all the time. But on the other hand, at the middle of the night, when there's no cars around, maybe I can see a lot of data. So there's this sort of question of what the noise is and how sensitive your instrument is. So if there's a really small signal, but your instrumental noise is too high, you're not going to be able to see that. And so, the other thing to sort of characterize into that, though, is, you can use the expected geophysical contrast and size of the anomaly to then sort of tailor the instrument that you want to use. So there's a lot of things to be sort of thinking about when you're designing these experiments. And so here's some examples. I could go through lots of examples, but I just wanted to show a couple of different examples of how we actually collect these data. So here's in the upper left, a geophone line out in the desert of Arizona, given here by Drew Foisto, where they're thinking about how to do seismometers on the moon. So you take an instrument and spread it out into a long line here. This is maybe a few hundred, maybe 20 or 50 meters long. There's these big involved deployments where we put out lots of instruments, either using some sort of automated system. This is a system that can put out a geophone line, basically pick it up and move it without anybody interacting with it except through the software. Or we have more sort of involved where the geophysicist is actually part of the equation in collecting the data. Here's a colleague of mine pulling a GPR on the Greenland ice sheet and basically collecting information about the subsurface structure there. As you start going to larger scales, you need to sort of scale up the tools that you use. This is a aerial magnetic survey and what was collected essentially on a helicopter platform. So of course you can go to satellites and start collecting data in the global sense. So there's a lot of different ways to essentially approach data collection in geophysics. Sort of the final sort of introductory slide on this is that there's a lot of other considerations too, is that you're not just collecting the data and then walking away. You really need to know where you collected the data. So having a really precise measurement in some cases of where the data collections were, so that when you go back and do those analyses, you know where your instruments were. You oftentimes have to keep track of the timing between instruments or on an instrument so that you know how you can relate those things back, not just in space, but also in time. And keeping those things synchronized is one of the challenges that we have to deal with. There's also the surface topography, like if you're collecting different kinds of geophysical measurements, sometimes the surface topography can kind of get in the way of trying to understand what's going on beneath. And so you need to know exactly sort of what the actual variation in that topography is, and that's sort of related to knowing where the measurement was made. And then of course you're creating data, so you have to have some sort of management of the amount of volume of data that comes out of your experiment. And then to collect those experiments, depending on if you're doing powered or passive, you're going to need to have some sort of battery or some sort of power source that you can then feed into the instrument to make the kind of measurement, which also can run the computers and help store the data on that. And so all of this is mass and its volume. So like, depending upon what you're trying to do, that's something that you need to consider when you're thinking about making these kinds of measurements is, okay, can I even get this instrument and its all the things that it needs into the field, given the kind of thing that I'm trying to do. And then that's sort of tied back into the logistics of actually executing the experiment. If you only need like 10 minutes to make your measurement and go into the field and come out, or does it require two days to make that kind of measurement? How long do you need to be there to actually do that? Does the instrument need to sit there for several years to make its measurement? So these are all sort of some of the things that go on top of the actual measurements themselves that we have to think about. All right. So how do we take this terrestrial knowledge and then translate it into the planetary sphere? Well, we're building here off of the heritage from what Apollo did during the Apollo missions. There was a lot of geophysics, and I like to call it the kitchen sink of geophysics, because they did just about everything you can possibly imagine on the surface of the moon, which makes sense. You want to try out some of these terrestrial approaches. But keep in mind, this was done back in the late 60s and early 70s. So some of the tools that they were using were, we've had 50 years of development and advancement in the technologies. So there were challenges that they ran into. There were some measurements that got made that probably could have been done better now with new technology, but that's because we have this sort of additional 50 years to advance that. But I think it's a great wealth of knowledge that lets us understand essentially how we can go back to the moon, for example, and do these kinds of measurements with these new kinds of tools. And what we've learned from the Apollo, we can then incorporate into that. There's also been a huge number of campaigns to collect data from orbit. So we're not just collecting geophysical data on the ground, but using potential fields and then basically measuring how those fields vary as you fly over these different terrains. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but there's been some really fantastic data sets that have been collected that let us sort of plan for future near surface geophysics studies where we can look at some of these structures in much higher resolution and get to the scale of sort of the geological outcrop, like what they did with Apollo. And obviously I've already hinted at this, but there's all these really fantastic new opportunities sort of on the horizon for geophysics at the moon. There is these commercial lander payload services that could potentially deliver new kinds of measurements, and a few geophysical experiments have already been slated to fly on some of these as they start delivering new equipment to the surface of the moon. We're thinking about a new Frontiers class mission with the Lunar Geophysical Network, which would put new seismometers and new other kinds of geophysical nodes across the surface of the moon so we can have these long-term observatories. There's also rovers and other kinds of mobile platforms that are being considered for delivery to the moon to actually measure, for example, the variation in volatiles at depth. This is the Viper mission. There's also Artemis, which will be putting new boots on the ground. So Apollo-style sort of investigations where we go to a site and start to think about, okay, what kinds of measurements do we want to make about the subsurface that can tell us more about the area that the Artemis astronauts land in. And then, of course, our international partners are all thinking about the sort of same kind of thing. There's plans for maybe a European Lunar Geophysical Network kind of approach that's in there. And so the kinds of things that people are thinking about for this, of course, ice is on the mind of everyone, especially at the polar regions. There's also the idea of maybe we can use lava tubes, for example, on the moon as a place where we can find shelter for astronauts or establish a future human base on the moon. Trying to understand some of the things that we've observed with these past missions and put some kind of framework on the ground, what exactly is causing these anomalies that we see from orbit, and many, many, many more research topics. So I just want to make sure that we have time to get to some of the examples. But I think this is a really exciting time if you're in geophysics and you're thinking about Planetary to have possibilities for new measurements. And of course, I would be remiss in not saying that we're not making new measurements elsewhere in the solar system. I'll focus on a little bit of that later. All right, so how does this all tie back to the theme of this working group? And that's, I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but the idea is that we're interested in how we can take this information here on Earth and translate it to the planets. And I would say one of the big advantages here is that studying things here on Earth is relatively low cost and risk as opposed to going out to the solar system and making the measurement going, oh, maybe we should have done that differently. I like to think about it, this is a way for us to identify and overcome the challenges before a mission, and we can also use analogs, and they are used here on Earth to troubleshoot during missions. I mean, like if you're trying to understand why something isn't working on the planet, you can go to an analog here on Earth maybe and try to get some wisdom from that. And then even afterwards, studying how some of the challenges that occurred during the mission, after the mission ends. So like if you collected a data set on the moon and you're trying to understand why it didn't quite get what you needed, you can go into the field here on Earth and try and understand that better here. It's also a place where we can think about how we would actually go about doing this exploration. Instead of build an operational model that would then translate back to like how you're going to do this somewhere else, so that you get the best data, you get to make the measurements the most efficiently. And then also it's a place to make sure that the equipment that we take is ready and tested and capable of making the measurements that we want in those environments that we get to them. And so ultimately what this does is improves the science that comes out of missions, improves the science that we can do here on Earth, and we learn something about the planets. I like to say also too that, when you're doing analog research here on Earth, you really great, amazing opportunity to engage students, the public, educational opportunities sort of just come out of this kind of research naturally. It's usually fairly high visibility. People are very interested in learning about what we're doing, and it's really kind of a neat way to get new people and create future colleagues for our discipline. So I think that this is an important component of what we do in planetary analog research. And so how can we use this kind of approach to benefit and enable the kind of geophysical tools that I've been talking about up to this point? Well, so one of the things that we can think about is, well, what are we specifically trying to focus on here? So I'm going to talk about, in this case here, thinking about using an analog environment. So we go to an environment and figure out, okay, how well does this represent the geological contrasts, the kinds of structures that we would expect to see, and then how can we use our tools to try and then figure out where those structures are and make our measurement, right? So in this case, what you want to do is answer the question essentially of how well does your area reproduce your expected geophysical contrast. So what is an analog for one particular particular kind of study may or may not be a good geophysical analog. So you have to sort of carefully study what it is that you're trying to understand and make sure that if you're using this analog environment, that you have the kinds of contrast that you might be interested in. The other component to that too, and this is, like I said, it's a monkey on all of our backs, but what kind of noise is there? Like, so if I go to the moon and make a seismic measurement, the amount of noise that I expect in the background that you cannot achieve anywhere on Earth. It's much too quiet on the moon. Earth is way too noisy. There's no way you're ever going to be able to achieve those really low amplitudes. But if you're just interested in the structure and then thinking about the kinds of signals, you can actually then pull in some models to try and understand that. And so, you know, if you're doing a magnetic measurement, you need to be concerned about, okay, what's the magnetic structure of the planet that you go to? So you can think about these sort of geophysical environments and how they would translate to what you're trying to study. We can also think about this in terms of operations and, you know, doing things in instrument deployment on the surface of other planets. So like, if you're trying to answer a specific question, what is the kind of experiment geometry you might need, and how would you go about putting that out onto the surface of, say, the moon or Mars? And then thinking about how, okay, can the equipment that we're using in the field be made more robust, more resilient to like challenges that you might find in the field on another planetary body, like stringing out a 100-meter long cable on the moon with astronauts is tough. They've got all these suits they have to wear. You have to somehow get the cable out. If we can make our instruments more autonomous and self-encompassed and lighter, lower mass, lower power, this can all help make those kinds of experiments more readily accessible to future missions. So those are the kinds of things that we can think about with this kind of analog. So what I want to do for the rest of the talk is walk the group through a couple of examples from my own research and my research group so that we can kind of share some of the things that we're thinking about, and maybe it will inspire some ideas amongst folks that are thinking about this kind of approach or maybe working on this kind of approach. And so I'm going to take us to 4 different worlds. Earth is, of course, our sort of base of operations where we do our analog research. But I'm going to walk through sort of 3 different examples from the outer solar system, thinking about icy ocean worlds, also from the moon. We cannot forget the moon. It's a really important place for interesting stuff going on. And then, of course, Mars. So the first of these is thinking about how we can go about developing a geophysical exploration strategy for looking for these subsurface voids and cavity spaces that might be associated with, say, like a lava tube on the surface. So that's the one I'm going to go through first. I also talk about an icy ocean world analog that we're doing, which is thinking about how you would actually do a seismic experiment on one of these bodies. And then an analog study that we did here on Earth to try and better understand how the InSight mission is going to try and basically try and recover the Martian core from the seismometer measurements of Mars quakes. So let's start with the moon. The analog that I've been working with here over the past 5 or 6 years is basically thinking about these terrestrial volcanic fields is essentially a place to study how we would go doing these geological and volcanological studies on the moon. And the areas that I've been working on are the San Francisco Volcanic Field in northern Arizona. There's also collaboration with Kelsey Young's Tubex project in the Lava Beds National Monument in Northern California. And then, of course, we're thinking about this in terms of a sort of relationship to the Marius Hills and the Oceanus Parcellarum on the moon. So, I mean, these places are, lots and lots of little volcanoes, cinder cones. There's lava flows. In some cases, these are lava flows that are connected to the cones, or they might be independent of the cones. There's all kinds of science that we can do that would sort of inform us essentially what's going on in sort of the volcanological background of these fields. There's also the potential for studying what kinds of resources might be available. So like, the tephra and the cinder that come out could also be sort of the basis for a building material. In fact, in northern Arizona, they use this to make all the roads, for example, in the region there. Some of the cement and brick factories are taking the cinder from that and turning it into building products. Where the volatiles might sit in this, if there's frozen ice beneath the surface, or on Mars, maybe there's a water table. And then what kinds of ores or other kinds of useful materials might be present within these things. And then, of course, this idea of looking for void space and using that as a potential either place to do science or think about what's going on in the for protecting astronauts. And then all of this sort of translates to how we can actually then do these kinds of observations on other planets. And so in this particular case, the San Francisco Volcanic Field was used to train the Apollo astronauts. So they bombed a a cinder deposit near Sunset Crater, and then had the astronauts move around there and basically do geology like they were on the moon or on the newly created craters. So what I'm going to focus on here is my analog, geophysical analog, is essentially how we can go look for lava tubes, these sort of subsurface cavities that lava once flowed through and created caves that now we can go probe for with geophysical tools. So why are we interested in lava tubes? Well, they're like I said before, this resource that could be potentially used for enabling exploration. They're a place where astronaut crews could go and basically get out of, say, a solar wind event, and also protect them and their equipment from harmful radiation just in the environment in which they're working. And it's also very stable temperature-wise, so it might be a place where if you're looking for isothermal conditions or don't want to have to heat or cool as much, then you could go place your instrumentation in there. And you also have some sort of shielding automatically from meteorite and micrometeorite impacts. So there's some advantages to actually being in one of these spaces. They're also a great place for studying essentially how lava flows evolve and have changed. You can study changes in the temperature, the flow rate, and the cooling rate of the lava flow by looking through the stratigraphy within the lava flow itself in the tube. You can also study how maybe composition of the lava changed throughout the eruption. And then for places where you maybe have an atmosphere, you could produce some sort of unique environmental niche inside of these lava tubes that have, potential maybe to protect a life form, like on Mars, for example, from the radiation in the environment or the effects of the constant diurnal temperature swing. And then sort of another point too is that lava tubes are also a place where you can go and you might have pristine samples that haven't been altered through maybe surface weathering or micrometeorite or interaction with the solar winds. You could have these sort of unique samples that you could get advantage of that would tell you something about the evolution of that flow. So there's a lot of interesting ways reasons to go into lava tubes and think about them. In terms of what the geophysics can inform us on this is we're interested, of course, in the contrast, right? So lava tubes are, by definition, a really good geophysical contrast because what you're doing is looking at the contrast typically between rock, in most cases basalt, and either air or vacuum. And both of these materials have very different properties geophysically. So it's really a strong contrast that's readily accessible to a whole bunch of different geophysical techniques. I'm going to focus here on the magnetic technique, but you could also do seismic or GPR, or resistivity or gravity measurements over these kinds of tubes. One of the challenges you run into is that your contrasts aren't necessarily defined by nice smooth layers. You have probably irregular surfaces and ceilings. There's also going to be cracks and fractures in the material that might make it more difficult for your geophysical tool to see down through that. And the way we actually go after these tubes is you need to have some sort of 2D or 3D survey. And you can't really do a good job of finding a lava tube with just a point measurement. You really need to have either a series of point measurements or a line or some sort of survey across where you think the tube might be to try and find that signature. So for the Earth, the scale of this is somewhere on the order of 10 to 20 meters wide in terms of the sizes of the tubes. There are places where you can get up to like maybe 100 meter or more type tube anomaly. So that kind of changes the scale of your survey in terms of how you're going to try and find these things. Okay, so the example here I'm going to walk through is it's basically Skull Cave, or in the Modoc Volcanic Field up in the Lava Beds National Monument, which is up in Northern California. So we have this star here shown on the map, basically where this field site is. Here's a picture of Skull Cave for reference. There's a human hanging out here in the shadows. So it gives you an idea about the scale of the cave itself. The map over here on the left shows sort of the caves themselves outlined in black and with the white interiors, and then maybe collapsed pits or trenches that are associated with the tube itself. So this tube is partially exposed, where the parts of it have collapsed into the tube itself, but then there's also nicely preserved tubes themselves. So you can go over these and make measurements. In this case, my graduate student, PhD graduate student Ernie Bell, went out with a magnetometer strapped on his back and walked and walked and walked. I mean, this seems like something that a robot should do, but in the case of this surface, that wouldn't be very feasible. So we have to take to the human platform to move things around. And he basically, as he walked back and forth, was recording the magnetic field, the total magnetic field intensity, and where he could go across the tubes because there was a roof on it. He took measurements and basically was able to record how the magnetic field varies as a function of space in this region. And what's nice about this particular study is that while he was out taking measurements with his magnetometer. There was another team that was down inside of the tubes and on the surface, taking LiDAR scans of the geometry of the rocks all around and finding the shapes of the tubes. So this gives us a way to then sort of ground truth our measurements at the surface against what we know the structure to be at the subsurface. Okay, and so as we do as geophysicists, we want to create a model. And so in this case here, we're thinking about, okay, we have data and we want to create a model, take our model and then basically use that to infer how can we find the geological structure beneath, in this case, the size of the tube. So what we're doing is essentially a forward model where we have this structural model of the tube from the LiDAR, and then we have our theory, and then we can predict the data and make a comparison to the data that we collected. And the idea here is to find the strength of the magnetic anomaly through the tube, basically. So for different size tubes, how big is the magnetic field variation that you see at the surface going to change? And we note that on Earth, of course, we're in this sort of induced field where we have a magnetic field that's taking the magnetic permeability of the rocks, susceptibility of the rocks, and turning it into an induced field that then we can see the anomaly. On the moon, we would be looking purely for the change in from the remnant magnetism that might be frozen into the rocks from an early magnetic field at the moon to a cavity that doesn't have any magnetic field. And so we can use the geometry of an idealized cylindrical tube to then relate the depth of the tube or the thickness of the ceiling, the radius of the tube, the strength of the sort of cross-sectional area, so this is the geometry of the tube, to the kind of either background susceptibility or the actual remnant magnetism in the tube to give an idea how much the field should change. And then instead of using necessarily just a tube itself, we can also use the LiDAR point map to map out the shape of that tube and then model exactly what we would expect to see with that. And so here's 2 plots or 4 plots showing the observed data at the top. So this is the data over Skull Cave, and then the outline of the cave here is shown in black from the LiDAR, and then the magnetic anomaly here is shown in these reds and blues, showing you how the magnetic field goes up and down as you go over this tube. So there's a really strong anomaly associated with the tube. Another anomaly to the north of the tube, which is interesting. We're thinking that maybe there might be another passage up there. And then we can take our model and essentially come up with a prediction for what we would expect to see for the LiDAR-based tube. And as you can see, there's a nice magnetic anomaly here and then this little high to the north of it. But we don't actually see this low to the north, which makes us think that there's maybe something else going on. But if we just take the maximum, in this case, the minimum magnetic anomaly along sort of the axis of the tube here, and plot that up onto the graph over here at the left, and relate that to the actual geometry of the tube, you can see that there's this relationship that starts to show up. Now, maybe it's got a lot of scatter on it, but that dotted line here is essentially from the equation from the previous slide, where we're essentially able to find for a given tube sort of geometry. This is the cross-sectional area over the depth of the center of the tube squared, which gives us this sort of non-unit dimension, but it's related to the geometry of the tube to the actual magnetic field that we see at the top. And so that tells us that then we could predict based upon some sort of magnetic anomaly that we observe, and having some information like from a skylight, how big the tube is beneath the spot where we made that measurement. So that's kind of useful information that can then translate to making predictions for how you might decide to explore a lava tube, right? You don't want to go into it if you're not really sure how big it is down there. So you could look at the magnetic anomaly ahead of time, know something about the entrance, and then create this relationship that tells you, okay, at this spot here, there's probably a lot of cavity that you can work with. And so that's basically the idea behind translating this to the moon, is that you can take then that combination of the morphology and the anomaly to then start thinking about, okay, what would that translate to in terms of structure beneath? So I show an example here of basically a pit here on the moon, which is thought to have some sort of cavity space that continues in behind the lip of this rim. And it's, potentially part of some sort of lava tube system that got excavated. An example of something that might be tube-like, we're not really sure, I don't want to get into that debate right now, but is that we see these linear surface features on the surface of the moon. This is Reiner Gamma. It has an associated magnetic anomaly. In this case, it's basically kept the solar wind from interacting with the surface. So that magnetic anomaly is then basically providing a basis for sort of providing the trace of this. And so we could use our magnetic approach to try and figure out, okay, basically how big would a cavity space have to be beneath this to produce that kind of magnetic anomaly in the region. So lots of possible applications there. And Ernie's been working on this for the last few years, so it's going to be out in a paper here pretty soon that he's submitting. All right. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. I want to talk now about an icy ocean world analog. And the goal in this particular study is to figure out how a seismometer mounted on a lander versus put on the ground is going to perform on the surface of Europa. So we're basically studying essentially how you would do this deployment, and then how well it would be able to detect that subsurface structure that we're really interested in is the subsurface ocean. So shift into that. So we're moving to the outer solar system. So I think everybody here knows this object, but I'll introduce it anyways. This is Europa, Jupiter's moon. Basically, it's a little bit smaller than Earth's moon, but it's fairly different in the sense that it's covered with a 30 to 50 kilometer thick ice shell, and then underneath that about 100 kilometer thick ocean, liquid water ocean, and then a rocky body that sits beneath that. And this whole body is basically being perturbed by the tides, so it's interacting with the other moons around Jupiter. It's also being needed internally by Jupiter itself, and this is putting heat energy into the system and basically allowing this object to be quite active and dynamic. So this has generated things like cryovolcanism of the surface, where you're bringing water up to the surface and it behaves just like lava, essentially cools and flows and creates landforms. There's also evidence for fractures and cracks in the surface that are all relatively young in age, meaning the last maybe 50 to 60 million years. So this is a geologically young world. There's probably a large component of that being driven by the tides, where we see that surface deformation. And then there's also evidence that maybe that surface has undergone some sort of recycling and change through time, so that older structures have basically been reset as you resurface that icy shell. Telescopic observations have indicated that Europa might even have current activity, where there's active volcanism there. We're erupting ice erupting water ice into the atmosphere in these plumes. And there might be some communication between that ocean and the surface, which has made this a really interesting target for future science studies, because if you have this liquid water ocean and it's bringing stuff up to the surface, maybe there's a chance for us to sniff what's going on inside of that ocean and understand if there's any kind of astrobiological material that might be taking place, or if the ocean is completely dead, or what's its composition, learn more about what's going on. And so there's been this thought about perhaps having a landed mission that would follow on after this Clipper mission, which would be a multiple flyby mission, to select a landing site and then send an instruments package to the surface and actually start to interrogate some of this structure. And so obviously all of this sort of activity and tectonics translates into there's the potential that we have some sort of seismicity there. So if there's active surface structure, then maybe we could use that information to go at looking at the interior with a geophysical approach. And so when we're thinking about how we can actually do an analog study for Europa, one of the things that we need to think about, of course, is the contrast. And so an analog where we have some sort of ice, in this case thick ice, a few hundred meters to kilometer scale over liquid water, maybe rock underneath of that would give us some sort of at least geophysical contrast that we could use to study this system. We're never going to be able to quite get to 30 kilometer thick ice over 100 kilometers of water, but we can do our best to at least get that ice-water contrast into our analog. We also can think about, okay, where would seismicity come on Europa, where it's predominantly coming probably from ice quakes in the ice shell. Maybe there's some more classic tectonic quakes down inside of the actual rocky interior, but what we're going to probably be seeing, because we're closest to, are these ice quakes. So if you're in an environment where you can have fractures that are propagating in ice, that would be a nice analog. Obviously, Europa doesn't have an atmosphere, so on Earth, we want to make sure that if we're going to do these experiments, there's a way for us to decouple from the atmosphere. We still have sort of the common noise of the Earth on the background, but that's okay. We can just sort of work at bands of frequency that are outside of that. And then have a lander model or some sort of placing of the instrument on that model that sort of replicates what we would expect to see for these future missions. And so the field site I'm going to describe for this study is in Canuck, Greenland. This is in the northernmost portion of Greenland up here, just north of Thule Air Force Base. The square here shows it. The Canuck is down here. And basically you take a helicopter flight up onto the ice, and what we've, a past radar set of surveys have found is that there's these subglacial lakes that are sitting beneath about maybe 800 to 700 meters of ice. And that these lakes basically are persistent over several square kilometers. And so we had a field season where we basically positioned our camp on top of one of these lakes. Here's the field site that we went to. It's this nice white flat plain. There's no surface topography what to think of. It's very general gradual slopes right near the ice divide. So ice velocity there is only a few centimeters per year. And what we're looking for is basically these lakes. This is an example of a place just to the south where a subglacial lake, there used to be a glacier over this. There's a little pond of water here that's iced over, is sitting now at the surface. And so that's sort of the same scale of what these lakes are that we're looking at. And there's no scale in this diagram, I'm sorry, but it's about 2 kilometers across. So, all right, so the goal there was to essentially study these lakes and see how well we could actually get them with our seismic equipment. So we did some passive seismic monitoring. We put out a seismometer over a summer. We also did IPR, ice penetrating radar, ground penetrating radar for everybody else. We also did some active source seismology where we took out some lines and essentially measured the change in the velocity structure with over distance. And then we had some monitoring stations out there to sort of keep us informed on what's going on at the site throughout the summer. The kinds of experiments that we did, you can see here, here's our a lander that we put down inside of a box, which was buried, and then we put instrumentation that recorded the signals. These are seismometers that are sitting on the deck and on the legs. There's also some seismometers buried underneath the instrument. We did a mobile scanning with this ice penetrating radar and then put out seismographs that would then measure around this. So we had a whole lot of different kinds of geophysical measurements at this site. Here's an example of the results from our active source survey where you're looking at now the first reflection from the lake itself. This is from a hammer hitting the ground about 800 meters down. And then you can kind of see the surface topography as we leave the lake here at on the right margin. This R2 down here is just the wave that travels down, back up, back down, back up. So you're seeing the second reflection essentially. And I note that this was done with a person swinging a sledgehammer. So you're seeing almost a kilometer down into the ice with really clean reflections with very small amount of seismic energy. And if you zoom in on this, you can actually start to see more complexity, which are reflections from the lake bottom, the lake top, and maybe even some reverberations that are taking place in some sediments that are sitting beneath that. So with a small amount of energy, even in the warm sort of ice on the surface of Earth, you can actually see a kilometer down into these subsurfaces. That's really kind of cool to me, since there's a lot of hope for us to be able to sound into the ice of Europa. We can also study how that lander performs. So the simulation here on the left is showing the response of this lander platform to an incoming seismic wave and basically activating really exaggerated some of the resonances that occur within the lander model. But if you look at this in as a function of frequency and essentially how well the instrument on the ground behaves compared to the instrument that's sitting up on the lander, you see that there's nearly one-to-one coherence at most low frequencies. And that means that the lander itself, at those really low frequencies is not really responding much to the ground. Well, it's responding to the ground just as if you were to put the instrument down on the ground. But as you go to higher frequencies, you start to see some differences between the two, and that's a result of these resonances that you see in the lander. So basically what that says is that if you were to put this instrument on top of the lander and put it on Europa, as long as you're below those resonant frequencies of the lander, you still should be able to see the ground motion from the incoming seismic waves, that's actually pretty promising because it's hard to put an instrument on the ground. And so I would say that for this particular study, what we're establishing, and this is work to be still to be published, but basically we can say that the seismometer should be able to see those subsurface liquid ice contrasts, and actually with not a lot of energy needed to actually do it. It just needs to be at relatively higher frequencies to get to the nearer structure. And then the noise from the lander versus putting things on the ground, you have to be sort of considering, making sure your lander resonant frequencies aren't sort of cropping over into your seismometer band, and that we can probably get away, at least on airless bodies, with mounting these kinds of instruments on spacecraft, as long as we're not trying to go for the highest frequencies in our experiments. Okay, so I'm probably running out of time, but let me talk a little bit about this study that we did that basically tried to use a single station seismometer on Earth to translate to how we would go and find the Martian core using the InSight mission. So Earth obviously is this stratified body. We have a crust, a mantle, a core, an inner core. And seismometers have been sort of the preeminent tool for establishing this sort of stratigraphy that we see inside of our planet. We look at waves that reflect and traverse the core, and we can use that to try and study essentially the depth of the core, the properties of the core, that kind of thing. And so for Mars, we don't necessarily know the structure. We know some details now that we've had insight there for over a year, actually going on 2 years. But the idea there is that we can use the same kinds of techniques to try and work out the stratigraphy for this body. So here's a theoretical model for the Martian interior where the core is essentially roughly half the planet. So we can use seismic waves to essentially figure out how deep that core is. And so one of the experiments we can do on Earth is essentially put out a single station seismometer and figure out, okay, how many earthquakes on Earth do we need to detect the core? And then, based upon the distribution and size of those events, how well are we able to recover that core? So we can use that and then say, okay, for InSight, how many events are you going to need to recover that core? How well can you recover the core with what kind of certainty, given the uncertainties on the event locations? So it's a way for us to study the same problem, but just use data from Earth rather than from Mars. And this was a study that was done before we had landed, so it's actually useful for sort of informing what's going on. And now we can test it now that we're starting to get data. So how do we actually do this? So what we're looking for is this seismic wave called SCS, which is basically a reflection from the core, just like a P wave reflecting from the lake. It's an S wave that reflects from the core of the Earth. It's a solid liquid contrast. The picture here on the left is size before deployment, or this is one of the test models that put inside of this seismic observatory in the Black Forest Observatory in Germany. And then here's size on Mars, underneath its little cozy wind and thermal shield, recording away, listening for Mars quakes. And so let me play for you a Mars quake. I like to do this because it's fun. This is 235B, one of our bigger events. It's supposedly originated around Cerberus Fossae, which is a geologically young region on Mars. And so let me play this. I don't know how this is going to come through the people's speakers, but I'll play it again. So you can hear the P and the S waves, those little cracks and booms that come through that. So yeah, there's definitely data coming from the interior of Mars. And I note here that there's potentially energy from SCS sitting out here in the coda of this S wave that we're studying right now, trying to understand. Oops, I was going to play for you again. All right, so what we did is we basically built this database of events from this station in Germany. This is with my student, Angela Marusiak, who just finished her PhD here this spring. Congratulations to her on getting through this COVID-19 business. Finishing a PhD is a daunting task, and doing it inside of a virtual space is even more so. But what she did is she basically would build a catalog of events using these terrestrial events where you could have basically assumed things that we could get from Mars, like the distance from the P minus S time, some sort of polarization to get the back azimuth of the event. And then the events would be detectable above the background noise. We're not going to identify it as an event if we can't even see it above the noise. And then we also made the assumption that we're going to see predominantly shallow sources at Mars. So then you can randomly draw events from that database and make a catalog for what you would sort of have at a single station based upon the probabilities of sort of seismicity at Mars. And then what you do is you can then arrange those data based upon their distance and then try a bunch of different models for core depth and essentially try to find energy that lines up along the expected arrival of this SCS arrival. And so you stack that up, and then if you see a coherent peak, that tells you that you have a potential core detection. And so the question then becomes like, how many of these events do you need? How well do you need to know where they are? All these sort of different parameters to actually then get something that would focus and tell you, okay, that you have a core detection on Mars. And so she did this kind of study and saw that there's a pretty strong trade-off, of course, with the mantle velocity and model that you use. You're not going to have necessarily one-to-one correlation of depth and velocity. You need to have some sort of model that comes from that. So there's going to be that trade-off there. But you can recover a Martian core given some assumptions about these other parameters about 88% of the time with at least 5 events, which is actually pretty good. That means that there's a pretty good chance that you're going to get a Martian core recovery if you only have 5 really relatively good events to work with. And the uncertainty here, at least for the Earth, is around 28 kilometers, plus or minus. If you put some distance uncertainty into that, that nearly doubles the uncertainty in the core detection. But we're still within the sort of requirement that we see the core within plus or minus 200 kilometers on Mars. So we can also play some other games where we add energy from some of the other multiples in the interior of SES bouncing around many times, like the R2 in our lake. And that doesn't actually necessarily make the problem better because of the fact that we're adding sort of more noise to the stack because those are weaker amplitudes. And so how does this all translate to Mars? This is something that we're working on right now, is that we can basically take those pre-landing models that were created before we go in and essentially think about, okay, what Mars quakes that are out there that we've recorded so far satisfy our sort of our signal to noise ratio constraint. So if it's greater than a 2.5, that means this is an event that we can use. And there's about 10 Mars quakes that fall into that category. And then we have about 3 or 4 Mars quakes that have that sort of source location that we can then start to do the detection with. Now note, this is just a little bit less than what we would like. I would say 5 to 10 is probably the range of what we're looking for, but we're within spitting distance of actually having enough events to start to do this analysis and look for the core. We do have pretty poor constraint on the depth of these events, which just adds a little bit complexity to that. We have the advantage though on Mars that there are no surface waves. This is a synthetic shown from Mars. You can see these beautiful surface wave dispersions. Those don't exist on Mars, at least for the events that we've seen so far. So that opens up our distance range where we can see this SCS arrival, this bright blue guy coming here and actually into the range where we see surface waves on the models, but they're not actually found on Mars. So I would say that core detection on our Mars is imminent. So stay tuned for that. Keep your eye out for pubs, and I'll let folks know as we get forward into that. All right, so I'm like way over time at this point. So I guess my summary of all of this is that we really need these kinds of studies to sort of inform the next generation of astronaut and surface missions. I mean, these are really sort of valuable kinds of approaches to making things work well for the astronauts. And it's also a way for us to update some of the knowledge that was gained from Apollo and make sure that the equipment that goes to the moon on the next generation is really gonna do what it was sent there to do. There's a couple of examples from Apollo where equipment had either been properly tested or field tested and it didn't operate when they got to the surface of the moon, which is a real letdown for many of the people who worked hard to make those instruments go. I would say for the icy ocean worlds that this kind of approaches are really saying that we need to do these kinds of measurements. There's going to be some really great science that comes out of a landed mission to say to the surface of Europa or Enceladus or Titan with the upcoming Dragonfly mission that we're going to give us some information about the deep interiors that are going to talk to a lot of different disciplines. And then of course for Mars, I mean, we're using analog studies right now to understand what the issues are with like the HP3 heat flow probe as it's trying to enter into the subsurface. We've gone deeper into Mars than any other mission has ever gone. And we're running into all kinds of challenges and things that we didn't know about the geology that are being studied here on Earth in the laboratory to try and better understand, okay, what's going on with that equipment, for example. All right, so this brings me to the end. I would be remiss in not acknowledging the gigantic team of people who have contributed to these types of studies. The SSERVI team, obviously, if I put them all here, they would fill a whole page themselves. And then a whole variety of people at the different institutions that we've worked with over the years for these different kinds of study, which I won't go through them all by name, but just thank you to everybody who's ever been part of this. It's definitely a big crew effort to do this. And also, if you want to learn more, I'll just flash this slide. You can maybe come back to it if you want to read more about it. But there's a bunch of presentations by my group at the Exploration Science Forum next week that are going to tie into these kinds of studies, not necessarily focused on what I showed here, but maybe their own research. But there's a lot of opportunities there if you want to learn more about some of the things that we're doing at the ESF next week. So with that, I will take questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. That was an excellent talk. We're a little bit over time. We have maybe a couple minutes for 1 or 2 questions. If anyone has anything they want to ask Nick, you can use the chat box or you can raise your hand in Zoom and I will try and get your question. While people are thinking, Nick, I had a question for you. So you mentioned the need for acquisition time and instrument time in the field to collect the data. I'm wondering if you could say a few words about the post-processing time. How long does it take you to get that data from the field and make sense of it afterwards? And can you do that fast enough to make tactical changes to your field acquisition on Earth and then thinking forward to the moon as well? Or does that just sort of happen after the field deployment and then the next deployment you go out and make any adjustments?
That's a fantastic question, and it actually depends a little bit on the method that you're using. Um, so, for example, a GPR, you can get almost instant feedback. Like it'll just display the reflectivity as a function of depth as you move along. And as long as you have someone who is fluent in interpreting those little wiggles, you can immediately say, oh yeah, the target's like maybe a few meters down below the surface. So you can actually do that almost in real time. So like if you have an astronaut and you want them to do GPR interpretation, you better train them how to do that before you send them. But for other methods, there's a bit more of a processing backlog. So like for example, a seismic tool, there are ways for you to visualize the data right away as it comes in so you kind of can data quality control. But in terms of interpretation and going back and doing the reflection processing, that kind of thing, you probably have to spend a little bit of time either picking the waves or making some sort of post-processing. But it is possible to automate some of that. So if you can automate it, then you could then turn it into something like a GPR where you'll have it immediately have some sort of profile that comes back maybe after you've collected the data. But other kinds of data like magnetometry and that kind of thing, you know, you're probably going to have to go to the computer and do a little bit of modeling to get to the point where you can have an interpretable data product. But as we start getting like more efficient computers, we can actually start to automate a lot of those kinds of algorithms and start to turn out data products almost in real time in the field. Like when I'm out in the field, I can sit at my computer for an evening and churn out a new product. And then the next day we can readjust and come up with something new. So you can kind of imagine a back room taking the data in the evening and then telling the astronauts in the morning, maybe here's a new strategy for where you want to go explore.
Okay, great. And we have 3 more questions in the chat box. So I'm cognizant of everyone's time. So maybe we can just go through these 3 quickly and then we'll call it a day. First one is, during COVID times when fieldwork will not be really happening for many months, what are some of the key areas in geophysical terrestrial analog studies that can be developed further?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my third example there of Mars, where what we did is we took data that already exists out in the community. In this case, the IRIS community, the Incorporated Research Institutions for Seismology, those data are available to the public. And so we constructed that experiment without collecting any new data. All we did is go out and collect the data that was there and then use those data to do this sort of analog kind of study. So I think there's lots of creative ways that we can use already existing data sets to do this kind of geophysical study. As long as you have information about where those instruments were and how they collected the data, you could then turn them into a little analog study depending upon what you're actually interested in looking at. So you have to think about what fidelities you have, but you can definitely take advantage of the data sets that are out there. I mean, going out in the field and collecting new data is great because you have full control over the geometry and everything, but there's also other ways to do this.
Okay, next question is, when thinking of icy bodies, are there any methods for looking at structures that are sub-ocean, especially given an interest in life, looking at the contact between rock and the ocean bottom?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. And in theory, we can do it with seismology. You just have this 100 kilometer thick layer of ocean that you have to propagate your waves to. So the energy that travels through that and then back up to the surface is going to be fairly limited. But if you had seismicity within the body, maybe you could get some information about that. It's a little bit more challenging for some of the EM techniques because this big ocean layer basically creates this big attenuation body that you lose a lot of your signal. But, you know, with the right tools, you can maybe get some of that information.
Okay, and final question. Aloha from Rodrigo Roma in Hilo, Hawaii. Have you considered or looked at Hawaii for your analog studies? Other than the icy world analog, we have everything else here.
Actually, we do some of our field work in Hawaii. We've been up on Mauna Loa volcano looking at some of the lava tubes up there. So who was the one that asked?
From Pisces, Rodrigo Romo.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, hi, Aloha, Nick. So we are expanding the catalog of analog sites we have on the Big Island. I know there's been a lot of interest in lava tubes. So we've been identifying several locations. And one of the advantages I think we have over the ones you showed is that we really have no plant growth or, you know, geological decomposition of the surface. So you have a pristine lava surface with lava tubes underneath. And again, seismic activity is just all day long here every time. So it would be a good place to develop and test any type of seismic instrumentation or GPR or LiDAR instruments for lava tubes. So maybe we should hook up at some point and talk about possible collaborations.
Sure, yeah, that'd be great.
Super. Well, thanks everyone. We're a little bit over the hour, but that was a great talk. Thank you, Nick, for taking the time to put this talk together and to deliver this to the Analogs Focus Group. And we will post this talk online if there's anything anyone would like to refer back to. And so thank you very much for coming, and thank you to SSERVI Central for hosting. And as Nick noted, next week, July 2020, is the NASA Exploration Science Forum. And because of COVID, that will be a virtual meeting as well. So there will be many, many talks, and that program is online. And you can refer to Nick's slides. He's listed some of the talks that might be of relevance or interest to this group. So thanks everyone, and have a great rest.